Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to set up Google Social Sign-On and integrate it with Amazon Cognito. So this is the end product that we're going to have by the end of this video. So this is the default hosted domain provided by Amazon Cognito. And you can see here over on the left-hand side, we have the option to sign in with our Google account. And optionally, users can sign in with their username and password that they set up directly with your user pool. So I'm going to walk you through all the steps on how to do this. This is a step-by-step tutorial. So let's get started. All right, everyone. So here we are in the AWS console. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to let you know of some prerequisites that you're going to need in order to set all this up. So first of all, obviously you need an AWS account. You need to sign into the console here. You also need a Google developer account. I'll put a link down below where you can access the Google Developer Console and sign up for an account. Only takes a couple of minutes, but you actually need that in order to create an application in Google to tie it to Amazon Cognito. And optionally, you may want to know a little bit about OAuth 2.0 and how it works, because we're going to be glossing over some of the concepts, some things such as scopes and claims. I'm going to do my best to define them as we go along, but it could be beneficial for you if you kind of do a little bit of research prior to watching this video. I'll leave some links down below in the description section where you can learn more. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a Amazon Cognito user pool. So let's go ahead and do that. And the easiest way is you can just go to the top here and type in Cognito, which will bring us to the Cognito section. So click on Cognito here, and this is our default screen. So we have two options here. The first one is manage user pools, and this is the one that we're going to be using in this exercise. We also have a concept of identity pools, not going to be getting into that in this video. So go ahead and click on user pools here. And if you don't have any user pools, this is what you're going to see in front of you here. If you did have some user pools that already exist, you'll see them listed in front of you. But since we don't have any, we can click this button here to create a user pool, or go to the top right and click on this blue button in the top right, which is what I'm going to do for this video. Okay, so just before we actually create our user pool, I just want to tell you what a user pool is. The name kind of describes what it is, but just to reiterate here, a user pool is just basically a collection of users, and each user has some attributes associated with them, things like email, first name, last name, all that kind of stuff. A user can be created either directly through Amazon Cognito using that hosted UI and by like registering for a name of your account, similar to how you would do with any login provider. Or optionally, a user can also be added through a third-party identity provider, such as Google, such as Amazon, such as Facebook, all the different identity providers that exist out there. Now, I'm going to show you how to set this up with Google, but it's basically the same process for these other identity providers. So if you're trying to do this with Facebook or Amazon, although you're going to be going to a different website to get your secret keys and all that, it's literally the exact same process from the Cognito side. So that's a little bit of background knowledge. Let's just go ahead and create our pool here. So the first screen that it's asking us for, the first input box, is our pool name. I'm just going to call this demo app user pool. Very descriptive name. Obviously, give this a name that's descriptive for your project. Do keep in mind that you don't want to necessarily make this too specific to a certain application, because you can have applications that are all sharing one user pool. So for example, you can set up like a user pool for your company, and then if you have different applications for your company, they can all share this one user pool. So just keep that in mind when you are naming this thing. So after you give it a good name, we have two options down here in terms of how do we want to create our user pool. So if you have some time, you can go through and step through all the settings, which is basically going to walk you through all these categories. So attributes, policies, MFA, which stands for multi-factor authentication, all this stuff. You can spend probably a few hours just going through this one by one and learning about this stuff. But for us, we're just going to use the defaults here, because most of this is fine as default and just as a toy example. But for a production use case, obviously, you may want to go through these one by one. So I'm just going to click on review defaults here, and we're going to click on this guy. So let's just go through very quickly a bunch of these things, just flying through them. So our pool name, required attributes for email. So the user is going to have to provide an email. If you want, like first name, last name, phone number, you can actually add your own if you require some customization here, but I'm not going to be doing that in this video. Alias attributes, username attributes, that's fine. Case insensitivity is always a good idea. You can also set your minimum password length. By default, it's usually 8. Password policy, so if you allow like uppercase letters, lowercase, special symbols, all that kind of stuff. Also some other details on email delivery, multi-factor authentication, tags, app clients. We're actually going to come back to this section for app clients after this. And then there's also triggers here as well if you want to do some custom integration with Lambda functions, which is kind of an interesting little side exercise. But for us, we don't need to care about any of this stuff, so we can just go ahead and click on Create Pool here. And sometimes this takes a moment or so, but that was pretty quick. So you can see we were successful. So we can see our user pool was created successfully up here. So now if you go back to the top left under user pools, we should see, yep, demo app user pool. So now you can click on this guy and this will bring us back to exactly where we were before. All right, so the next thing that we need to do here in Cognito is that we need to create a app client. And the way to do that is over here on the left-hand side here under the general settings section, there's a menu option for app client. So go ahead and click on this. Now, in order to understand what we're doing here, this kind of ties back to what I was saying before with a user pool that can serve multiple applications. This is a concept called multi-tenancy. You can read up a little bit about it on the Cognito or the AWS website under the Cognito developer guide. But it's just basically the idea that we can have one user pool that is leveraged by many different applications or many different client applications. So it turns out in order to set up any of this stuff, you need at least one, so one as a minimum app client. So let's go ahead and create our app client. So I'm going to click on add an app client here. And we need to give our app client a name here. So I'm just going to name mine demo app. And that's fine. And there's a whole bunch of different options here that you can take a look at and specify. So the refresh token, this is set to 30 days, the access token, how long you want that to stay valid for, ID token, all this kind of stuff that you can take a look at. Also some OAuth Flows configuration things. I'm going to leave everything default here. So nothing really that I'm going to specify. There are some interesting options that you can take a look at here, and you can of course learn more if you're interested in any of this in detail. Okay, so we don't really need to do much here, to be honest. We can leave all this stuff as default. So once you're done, just go ahead and go to the bottom and click on Create App Client. And this should, so this spits out a app client ID. You also have a secret key here. So this is, don't show people this. I'm just showing you this because it's a demonstration, but I'm going to delete all this stuff after, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's it for this part. The next thing that we need to do is we need to create our domain name. And the domain is basically the URL that folks are going to use to sign in to your application. And that's going to forward after the user signs in back to a URL of your choosing, where you can extract all the details out from the token and basically store that for later so that you know the user has already logged in. We're going to get more into that a little bit later, so don't worry if that didn't make sense as of now. So in order to proceed, we just go to the left-hand side here under app integration. You want to go to domain name. So click on that guy. And then you need to give yourself a domain name in this box here. So we can see here, if we take a look at it, it's got HTTPS, you put in whatever you want, and then it's auth. Whatever region that you're in right now. So if you look at the top right here, I'm in North Virginia, which is US East 1. But if I was in a different region, it would say, the corresponding region here. This doesn't really matter for all intensive purposes, but it's just good to know that this is how the URLs are constructed. Now, you can give this whatever name that you want. Keep in mind, though, that this needs to be globally unique. So I can't make something called like demo here. I'm sure this is already going to be taken. You can go ahead and click on check availability here. And so the domain is not available. So pick something that is, unique to your application or namespaced in some other way so that you're going to have no problem setting this up. Now, optionally, if you don't want to use like this ugly URL to give to your users in order to sign in, or you don't want it to show in the address bar, you can bring over your own domain. So this just requires, like it says here, it needs to have a certificate using ACM. And then you also need to do some DNS stuff, so like it says here. So you also need the ability to add an alias record to the domain's hosted zone. Not going to go into how to do that in this video. I would say it's more for, well, not really advanced users, but basically people that want their own custom domain, perhaps for another video. Okay, so for this example, let's just try to come up with something here that isn't going to be taken. Demo app URL be a better dev. This probably is not going to be taken, at least I would hope. Yeah, so this domain is available, like we can see up here. Now let's just go ahead and click on Save Changes, and everything should be good here. All right, so that's good for setting up the domain. Now we need to set up the user pool and the app client integration. And the way to do that is over here on the left-hand side under app client settings. So go ahead and click on that. And this is going to bring up a new slew of options here. So let's just run through what's going on here. So enabled identity providers. So currently there's only one option here, which is Cognito user pool. Now what this is saying is that for this application, the user can sign up and sign in using just a Cognito user pool. Now we're going to have to come back to this section later on once we set up the Google integration, and we're going to have an option here, like a box here that says Google social sign-on or something to that liking. But for now, we're just going to set it up using the Cognito user pool. I guess optionally you can do the other step first, but this is just the way that I did it. Okay, so sign in and sign out URL. So this is something that is part of the OAuth 2.0 kind of world where you have redirect URLs. So the callback URL here is a URL that you can pick of your choosing. So for example, I'm just gonna put a URL that I don't even know. You don't even have to use something that you particularly own as a demonstration, but in a real life use case, you want to own the URL where the callback is going to be sent post login. So let's just put something in here, then I'll explain like what's going on. So https www.example.com/cb. And then so that's the callback URL, which is going to be used on successful sign-in. Actually, maybe not even successful, even in the case of an error. So that's what's going to be used. And let's just copy that, and we're going to put sign out. So this is the URL for the sign out or post sign out. Okay, so how this essentially works is that when a user signs in using either the hosted domain, or if you integrate with this programmatically, so that screen that we were looking at before that had like the Google social sign-on thing, what will happen is that Cognito will redirect you to this endpoint, so example.com/cb. And what's going to happen is that in the URL itself, you're going to see something like this. It's going to be like question mark, and then there's going to be parameters that are passed in. So there's going to be identity token, and then that's going to be like some value here. And then we're going to see access token as well, because we're going to be using the implicit grant here, which is something I'm going to show you in a little bit here. And then there's going to be like an access token in here. And then basically from the application side, you need to extract the values from the URL string that's passed to you. Grab the identity token. This is called a JWT token or a JSON web token. There's a bunch of libraries that you can use to parse this and like grab all the details, like the real details out of there. And then the access token is what you're going to use to, if you want to use API gateway for your authentication and authorization, you'd provide the access token as part of the input to your API gateway call under the bearer header. And that's going to allow API Gateway to authenticate you. I actually have a whole video on integrating with API Gateway with Cognito user pools, and I'll put that in the description section below and maybe under the comment section or something. But that's just kind of a preview of what we're going to get to. But for now, you don't need any of that. You just need to give it a URL that you want to send it to, and the rest of it's going to be taken care of for you. Okay, so then we have the sign out URL, which is the same thing, but there's some special nuance to this, but we're not going to get into it in this video. Okay, so the next part that we need to talk about is the OAuth 2.0 allowed OAuth flows. Now this is kind of a big area, so I don't really want to spend too much time here, but I'll just give you a brief little summary. So what this is essentially asking you for is like, what is the flow of authentication that you want to use? There's a bunch of different flows obviously here. So let's go through them one by one. So the authorization code grant flow. So this is useful if you have a backend server available to you that you want to use to validate the token. And it's good for preventing man-in-the-middle attacks, which is a vulnerability of the OAuth 2.0 flow under some of the other grants. So this is useful for that kind of setup, but this will make more sense maybe when we talk about the implicit grant here, which is the one that we're going to use for this video here. So implicit grant doesn't require a third party, and how it essentially works is that after the user logs in directly to through the hosted UI, or if you're setting it up programmatically, what's going to happen is that the access token is returned directly back to the user through that URL header that we were just talking about, like the access token up over here. Now, the reason that's a problem is because if someone is like snooping on your traffic, or maybe, I don't know, there's some kind of keylogger in your system or something like that, or some kind of virus on your machine, someone can basically steal that token from you and then go and access your backend APIs, which is a pretty big problem. But for a lot of applications such as, web pages or web applications that are just statically hosted like a React app and don't necessarily have APIs, then that's the only real option. Also the same thing for like mobile applications that don't have an APIs. This is really the only option that you have to work with. Using authorization code grant, the user receives this temporary token which needs to be exchanged by the backend server with Amazon Cognito, and that prevents the man in the middle scenario here. There's a whole bunch of documentation on this, and I actually have a blog post that runs through the details of these two scenarios, so you can visit that if you're confused for a quick summary. And then client credentials is basically for machine-to-machine communication. Not going to really go through with it too much here and go through the details, but that's the idea of it. So we're going to use implicit grant here because we're going to basically want the access tokens right after logging in. So that's what we're going to go for. Next up is scopes. So again, I'm not really going to go too into detail on this, but scopes are just basically lists of identifiers that indicate what access privileges are being requested. So there's a couple here that are provided by default. So for this example, I'm just going to use phone, email, and OpenID. I'm going to use profile as well. You can actually select all of them if you want. It doesn't really matter. Again, scopes are a more detailed topic. I'm not going to really dwell on them in this video. So after you do that, you're pretty much good to go here. Notice that at the bottom it's saying the hosted UI isn't available right now. Allow at least one OAuth scope and then choose a domain name. So that is expected. Let's go ahead and click on Save Changes now. And you can see here now we have the option to launch a hosted UI. So if I click on this, there you go. This is our hosted UI. Now notice we don't have that Google social sign-on thing that we had at the beginning of the video. That's because we haven't added that integration yet. So if you're happy with this, you only want users to be able to sign in with a username password, then you can keep this as is. But since you're watching this video, you probably want to go to the next step. So I'm just going to close this tab here. And so our next step is to go ahead and create our Google application, which we're going to integrate with Cognito. So in order to do that, we need to head over to your Google Developer Console. And I think the URL for this, I'm just going to go to Google. So like Google Developer Console. And then, yeah, so we can just log in here. I actually have a tab open already, but this is essentially how I logged in. So that'll bring you to a screen that looks like what I have in front of you here. So this is the default screen. So what we first need to do is to create a project. If this is your first time using GCP or a Google Cloud Platform, then you may not see some of these details here. But since I already created a project, it's showing up here under my project 84 blah, blah, blah. But let's just create one from scratch here to show you through the whole motions. So I just clicked on this little caret here, this drop down. And these are some other projects, some like things that I was testing out with. In order to proceed, we want to go to the top right here and click on New Project. And this is going to ask us for our project name. So Google Project Social Sign-On. Obviously, give this a name that's useful for you. Location, we don't need to specify that. Let's just go ahead and click on Create here. And this will bring us to our next setting. So it's creating our project right now. Let's just give that a moment to finish up. Okay, perfect. So it just was successfully created. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to modify or configure rather our OAuth consent screen. So I'll put a screenshot of it up here as I'm talking, but essentially the OAuth consent screen, I guarantee you that if you've used social sign-on before, you've accepted the consent. And it's basically the screen that says, like, do you allow XYZ application to access your email, contacts, profile, soul, all that kind of stuff. But essentially you can go and configure that screen to configure like what's shown to the user, what type of information you're requesting, so on and so forth. Now, before you click on that, I just realized something actually. When you create a new project, it doesn't actually select it by default. So you need to go back to the top here after it's successfully created, click on that button again, and then go ahead and click on the project that you just created, or else you're going to be using a different one. Again, if this is your first time using it, you won't have this problem, but if you have multiple different projects up here, that will be a problem for you. Okay, so let's go to the OAuth consent screen like I was saying before and fill out all the settings. So first of all, it's asking us for internal or external. We're going to use external here. You can read on this, so only available to users within your organization. You will not need to submit your app for verification. And this one is available to any test user with a Google account. Your app will start in testing mode and will only be available to users that you add to the list of test users. Once your app is ready to push to production, you may need to verify your app. So when you're starting out, I just use external here just to make sure everything is wired correctly. But afterwards, you may need to submit to Google for verification steps so that you can basically go to prod. But since this is just a demo here, I'm going to skip that step. We're just going to be using external for this case. So go ahead and click on Create Now, which will bring us to the next screen. So for app name, you can name this, whatever you want. So you can give this whatever name that you want. So I'm going to call this Google Social Sign On app. Actually, it's not really, this name should probably be whatever you named your Cognito app when I really think about it. But you can basically name this whatever you want. So Google Social Sign On, put in your user support email. This is just going to be if anyone has a query about consent, it's going to be shown on that consent page as well. You can also put a logo here, which will show up. This makes it look professional. I suggest you do that, but not going to do that here. And then under app domain, this is again additional settings. So application homepage, application privacy policy link, terms of service. If you're any kind of public corporation or public company or setting this up for a public company, you probably want to put all your details in. But for most of you, you probably don't care about that. Okay, so for authorized domains, this is something that we need to change. So go ahead and click on Add Domain here. And we need to put in a specific domain. So the specific domain that we need to put in is AmazonCognito.com. And that's all you need to do for that box. Then finally, just put in your email address. So like, what is mine? The AWS Amazon here. Okay. If anyone wants to contact you here. Okay, so go ahead and click on Save and Continue now. This should bring us to our next screen. We are almost done. So this is the Scopes section. So Scopes in this context are the levels of details that you want to ask from the user. So if you want by default, you get email for free. But if you want, for example, their first name, last name, so phone number, stuff like that, you'd have to add or remove scopes here. So you can click this and there's a whole bunch of scopes that you can add. But we're not going to do any of that. We just want access to their email, so we can leave all of this stuff as default. So let's just go to the bottom here, go ahead and click on Save and Continue. And then we are at the test user screen. If you want to create a test user to access this stuff, you can. You don't need it though. I can actually use my real email when we integrate with Cognito. So go ahead and click on Save and Continue again. This just gives us a nice little summary here of all the stuff that we specified for our application. Now let's go all the way to the bottom and go back to our dashboard. Okay. So that's it for the OAuth consent screen. So now we need to finally do the linking between Cognito and Google, and we need to create a OAuth 2.0 client in order to do that. So what you want to do is go to the credentials section here in the top left, and we need to configure a client. So we're going to be using OAuth 2.0 here. So we have OAuth 2.0 client IDs. So we need to create credentials, and they're going to show up here under OAuth 2.0. So go to the top here where it says create credentials, and we are going to select a OAuth client ID. So as you can see, your request user consent so your app can access the user's data. Go ahead and click on that. And here you can set up different applications types. So if you have a web application, iOS app, Android app, Chrome, all this kind of stuff here, you can have different client IDs for each one so that you can control them that way. So we're just going to do for one in this example. And if you want to learn more about like why this is useful, you can click on this guy. It gives you some great documentation here. Okay, so name web client 1, you can name this whatever you want. I'm just going to leave this as default. So we need to do a couple things here. The first one is we need to add a URI under the authorized JavaScript origins. So in order to get the correct URI, if you just click on this guy, it's going to ask you for something. So what you need to do here is we need to go get our hosted domain URI, because that's the origin domain that's going to be trying to interact with Google. So you need to kind of whitelist that URI so that Google allows it. So in order to do that, we just go back to our user pool. I hope you still have a tab open. And if you have your hosted UI still open, you can go ahead and click on that. And it's actually in the top here in the name. So you can just copy this out. So mine is demo app up here, URL beabetterdev.com. Optionally, if you don't want to do it that way, I believe you can just go to domain name here. So you can copy it here. You can also click on app integration. So it shows you the thing here. So I'm going to do it this way. It's probably the easiest. So copy that guy. Let's go back to our Google tab, and you want to put that into your authorized JavaScript origins. That's fine. And so that's good for the authorized origin. That's good. So let's do the next step here. So authorize redirect URIs. So this is used for use with requests from our web server. Now we do need to put something else in here. So paste that same URL, the one that you have from up here, if it's still on your clipboard, paste that in there. Then you need to add something to the end of it. So you need to add /OAuth2, okay, and then /IDP response. And this is going to be the authorized redirect URI. Not going to get into like why you need to put in these specific responses. This is more to do with how OAuth 2 works. But for our case, that's all you really need to do here. So go ahead and click on create now, and you should be good to go. So so you get a client ID and a client secret. Now, if you don't copy this, you can always come back here and grab this stuff. I'll just show you how to do it really quick. So you have your client ID here, which is the one we just created. You can click on this guy, and over in the top right here, you see the client ID and the client secret. Obviously, don't share this with anyone, because that means that they could potentially compromise your credentials, and who knows what they can do with this kind of stuff. So make sure that this is kept secret at all times. All right, so keep this page open, or just like copy this stuff to like a clipboard or something, but keep the tab open. We're done with Google stuff for now, so we can go back to Cognito. And what we want to do now is finally integrate our Google identity provider with our Cognito user pool. So in order to do that, we need to go to the federation section of the user pool and go to identity providers. So go ahead and click on this guy. And we need to enable the identity provider that we just created, which was Google, but these are some of the other options that you have available to you. So obviously go ahead and click on Google here, and then it's going to ask you for some details here. So your Google App ID, your client, your app secret, and your authorized scopes. So let's just go back and forth here and copy that information out. So that's my client ID, going back, paste that in, and then we need our secret. Go ahead and paste that in. And then for authorized scopes, we can put in what they have as a preview here. So profile, email, and OpenID. Profile, email, and OpenID. And then click on enable Google here. So if everything worked correctly, I don't know if it does some kind of like confirmation on Google's side to make sure that those secrets and values were correct. But if there is an issue, you may have some trouble later on. But make sure that you get those client keys and secret keys put in correctly, or else you may have some kind of annoying problem later on. Okay, so there's one last step that we need to do. We need to translate the email from the claim that's provided by Google into what Cognito expects. And this will make sense in a second here. So we want to go to attribute mapping. Essentially, this stuff allows you to map attributes that are associated with the Google profile, and you can map those details to other names that exist on your user pool. So what we need to do here is, you can see email is one of those that we're going to want here. Now, it turns out email comes from Google as lowercase e, right? So if we click on capture here, we can see the user pool attribute is actually uppercase E. So if you have different ones, so for example, like names and all that, there may be some kind of incongruency that you need to address. But I guarantee you, if you don't do this to start off, at least in this exercise, you're going to have an error during the auth process when the person tries to log in. So make sure that you do that, or else you're going to run into some problems. Okay, so go ahead and click on Save Changes now. And everything should be good there. So now, you should be good to go at this point. We can go back to our domain name, and actually we want to launch our domain. So where is that? App client settings. Yeah, launch hosted UI. And we see here, this isn't working. We don't have that Google social sign-on box that we had before. That's because we haven't enabled it for our application. Remember earlier on I told you we'd have to go back to a certain section, and that section is right here. So we can see now we're under App Integration, App Client Settings. We have new identity providers that are available to us. So we have Google, which is new, so we can go ahead and click that. And Cognito was the original one that we had specified. This only shows up after you integrate or configure rather that identity provider that we saw before. So again, if you're integrating with like Facebook or Amazon or some other OIDC provider, you're going to have a pop-up here or like a multi-select that you're going to have to enable in order for anything to work. So let's go ahead and click on Save Changes now. And now if we click on Launch Hosted UI, voila, we see Continue with Google. So let's actually try this out. Continue with Google. Yeah, so this is my account. I'm already signed in. So you can see here, to continue, Google will share your name, email address, language preference, and profile picture with AmazonCognito.com. Sounds good to me. Click on this guy. And now we are being forwarded to our example.com domain. So look at the top here. We see example.com/CB. This is what I was originally telling you about before. This is our redirect URL. And then we can see we have this giant extra stuff. So access token equals blah, 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 blah. So let me just copy this out and put it in a Sublime Text tab here because it's enormous. Take that, paste that in. So let's take a look at what's happening here. So we can see here at the top, we have access token is equal to, which is this giant thing. And then it stops right here, right where I'm highlighting. And then we have an ID token, which corresponds to details about me, the particular user. So this will contain like your email and phone and all that kind of stuff. The access token is what you're going to use to communicate with other services. This is like the token that indicates that the user is authorized. The ID token just contains extra details about the user. Then if we look at the bottom, we see some extra details. So we see the token type, that's a bearer, and then we see that it expires in 3,600 seconds here. So everything looks good here. Let's go and actually like inspect some of these things, because you can actually go to a website to take a look at what is inside this token. So to do that, I just do JWT parser. Some website always comes up. I think it's jwt.io. Yeah, it's this one here. So you can click on this, and we can go here and use their debugger. So you can take all this out and paste in here. And then now you can see like the header doesn't change and the signature doesn't change. But all of this stuff inside payload is details that were basically provided as part of that access token. So we have our Cognito groups. We have what the token is used for. We have the scopes that we were requesting, auth time, a whole bunch of details here that give us information about this access token. So if we do the same thing for the ID token, let's grab that. Starts here and stops right there. Let's go back. Where is it? JWT. Yep. Take all this stuff out. So this should give us the information now about the person. So I only configured email, so it probably won't have any extra stuff here. So I pasted that in, and now we have some different details here. So groups, email verified. Where is my email? There it is, all the way at the bottom. So email here. So that's the detail that we requested originally, and that's been provided by Google. Another thing that's pretty cool to look at is that now after you've signed in with that user, you can go ahead and go under the general settings of your user pool and under the users and groups. Now you may have to refresh your page because this doesn't update right away. So just refresh here. And now you can see we have a new username, which is Google _ blah, 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 blah. And they are enabled. The account status is from an external provider. That's the external provider is Google. And then we have the email that's corresponding to the user here. So this just shows that everything worked correctly. So I hope this tutorial was useful for you. In terms of a next step, if you want to integrate this with API Gateway to control access to your backend APIs, I'll put a video on the right here where you can learn how to do that. So if you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.